Welcome to our webinar today on ethics and artificial intelligence, a socio-technical perspective. The webinar is going to feature an interview and an early presentation by Katrina Ingram. I'm not going to provide her with a lot of background about Katrina. I'm going to let her introduce herself. But other than that, we'll have about a 20-minute interview, and then we'll open up for questions as Peter and Michael and others. I'm sure we'll have questions of you, Katrina, as you begin. So without any further ado, I think you're on, Katrina. Let's go.
All right, let's go. Well, why don't I introduce myself first, and then I literally have not prepared a slide deck or anything of that nature for this particular talk, so we can just kind of have a free-form conversation. But my name is Katrina Ingram, and I started out my career in the field of AI ethics back in 2018, and that was following about a decade of work in the public broadcasting sector. So I worked with a community radio station, CKUA Radio. Some of you might be familiar with that name if you're here in Alberta. And I spent about a decade of my career there working in management roles when I decided it was time to leave media, wanted to try some new things, didn't know what they were, and found myself going back to do a master's degree. So doing a little bit of a midlife career pivot back in 2017. And in 2018, I wind up in this lecture that's being given by a prominent AI researcher, Dr. Jonathan Schaefer. Some of you might be familiar with that name. So I'm in Jonathan's lecture, and he's talking about AI gone wrong scenarios, unintended consequences, all of these harms, and he's very concerned about what he's seeing. And I wound up talking to him afterwards and saying, who's working on this problem? He told me not enough people. And so he and I started working on some of this work back in 2018, starting out with ethical codes and taking a look at ethical codes in AI. And that really kind of got me interested in this field. It really led to the work that I did for my master's research, which was in applied ethics. And when I graduated in 2020, I wanted to keep going with the work, but I didn't really see anyone focused on this, certainly not in Alberta. And so I launched my own company in 2021, a social enterprise called Ethically Aligned AI. And I've been doing this work ever since. So I do a lot of public talks. I was saying to Randall earlier, this is my 4th talk this week. So I do a lot of awareness building, hanging out in communities, answering questions, but I also do a lot of training. So I have various training partnerships. I've got a course on LinkedIn about building a responsible AI program. I launched Canada's first AI ethics micro-credential with Athabasca University in 2021. And I'm building some new products for Dataversity and LinkedIn as well right now. And I teach at the University of Alberta and at MacEwan University. So lots of different teaching opportunities. And then I also do advisory work and consulting with organizations, helping them put some of these ideas into practice. And so a lot of what I try and do is operationalize the ethical aspects of how to move forward with responsible AI. So that's a little bit about me. I'll just kind of pause there. And Perry, I'm happy to take this conversation wherever you want to go.
Well, how to move forward with responsible AI versus irresponsible AI? If we're responsible, we're going to capitalize on the extraordinary opportunities that AI or generative AI represent or present to the world at large and to people. But irresponsible, what are you getting at?
Yeah, I have to say some of what we've got right now is kind of irresponsible in my opinion. So let me just kind of like walk you through this a little bit in terms of I'll start with generative AI. And I always like to point out generative AI, while it's the hot topic of the moment, it's not the entirety of AI. AI has been around for a really long time, but let's start with generative AI and let's talk about some of the ethical concerns that I raise around this technology. So I put them into 3 different camps. So there's control, there is the design, and there is the use. So I'm just going to kind of walk through those 3 camps. So the first issue of control really relates to the idea that because these are really large systems, and I'm talking about things like large language models, sometimes they're called frontier models or foundation models, basically the GPT or the Claude or the Gemini, those kinds of models. And it's really only a handful of companies in the world that have the billions of dollars needed to actually train and make these systems. So yes, lots of people can build on top of them and that kind of thing. But when it comes to these systems themselves, it's actually a bit of a monopoly. So kind of it favors a monopoly, let's say. So that's the control issue. Then it comes to the design choices that were made to build this technology. So this technology is only possible because a lot of data was scraped from the internet. There's all kinds of copyright and legal questions around that training data. There's all kinds of ethical questions as well, even beyond the legalities of copyright, of whether or not that's right to take other people's data and use it in this way. And there's a whole, legal battle going on around that. So that's one piece of it. Then we know that the data itself, it's not the most representative data. It's kind of got some problems. There's biases that can arise from that data. So the data itself is problematic. And then we layer on the environmental cost of it. So I was actually just looking at a really good Washington Post article that came out this week and was talking about the massive cost of using these technologies. So every time we write 100 words on ChatGPT, we're using a bottle of water. This isn't a bottle, but it's a glass of water, just to kind of illustrate the point, in cooling all of this data and these data centers. And this is like 10xing what we do normally online. So we got a lot of environmental issues. And then on top of that, we have who prepared all the data that was labeled and went into making these systems. And that work gets offshored to people who aren't paid very well. So those are all things that happen before you even use the technology. And those are ethical issues that we need to grapple with if we're going to, move forward with these kinds of technologies. So that's a design thing. And then the last piece is the use case. What are you using it for? And there's a lot of different concerns around things like hallucinations, for example. And I always point out that hallucinations aren't really a problem because we don't really need truthful information coming out of a system. If we're writing a haiku, who really cares? But where the hallucination starts to come up as an issue is when we want these systems to do things that matter, like medical work or legal work or something substantive. So that, to me, is a bit of a mismatch of how we are applying these technologies. I think there's a sense that we can apply them everywhere for everything. And then that we layer on more tech to kind of deal with those hallucinations. So those, to me, I mean, it's not every ethical issue. I feel like I've been talking for a bit and I want to have more of a dialogue, but those to me are the big issues. And I think a lot of what we see is that we're not going to, the first two issues that I mentioned, we are not going to solve those individually. That's where collective action needs to happen. And especially the design issues, we need to sort of demand the fair trade coffee version of generative AI because we don't have it right now. And so that's why I would say it's irresponsible technology, not necessarily because we're using it irresponsibly, but because it was made irresponsibly.
Let me go, I was going to bore down into data, given some of the research that's done and some of the forecasts that follow the money. If there's $1 billion in the game, those with only 1 million are not big players. It's the $1 billion players that will determine the direction, and they carry certain values. The West seems to have the capital, and the West has been built on the principles of capitalism, which is profit. And the writers out of Harvard have said, very concerned that the usage of the data will be primarily for commercial purposes and for profit. And in that regard, it'll be a very narrow application because it's moving. I mean, trillions of dollars are flowing into this. So how do you contain, and I'm a capitalist, but I'm also a believe that regulations are necessary because capitalism will, in fact, advocate for monopolies and control. What agency, or can you envision what an agency might look like, or maybe not, that can give us any comfort that this evolution will, in fact, be in human interest?
I don't know why, but I'm thinking of the saying, you are the hero you've been waiting for. It's coming up to me. Like, I don't know. I think sometimes we think that there's going to be the big agency that's going to ride in and save us and, the UN or somebody. I'm not really sure. But I think that, I actually think individual people and even just having conversations like this, I think we have more power than we think we have. And we see this in, when we raise our consumer voices, for example. I'm not saying it's all about consumers, but that does carry some weight. And if customers don't like something, eventually companies decide that they're going to do some different things. And that's kind of how it works in a capitalist sort of society, right? Where you say, hey, I'm going to go buy Patagonia wear because I don't like the way that this other person manufactures their, rainwear or whatever it is, right? And so I think there is an element of that.
I think that you've touched on what I think we've generally arrived at in the various webinars that we've been doing on associated topics, and that is these two forces will exist. The one force that wants control, that's almost totalitarian in nature with a United Nations or a WEF, and the other, which is democracy, which at least advocates for individual interests to be protected. And there seems to be no single answer. It's like quantum theory versus Newtonian physics. We're going to have to live with these two perspectives. And sometimes they will be out of balance, which we call chaos. We've done a lot of talk about the value of chaos. In fact, it's a contributor to innovation. And if you over control, you don't get innovation, so you don't get development growth, you get containment, status quo, sustenance of a monopoly. I think that echoes, I think, the point that you're making.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's definitely, like, you want to call it chaos, you want to call it uncertainty, et cetera. I think, when I think about ethics, I think some of the value of ethics is the process of kind of making these choices in the face of uncertainty, in the face of a clear-cut way to go. And I think for me, that's kind of the value of this work. And it's sitting with organizations or sitting with community and helping them navigate that is what I find really rewarding in doing this kind of work.
Helping them navigate is in recognition that these are uncharted quarters. Quarters, it's an uncharted journey. We haven't been there before. So to chart it is to take values that you have and apply them to those that are on this journey that recognize there's danger ahead. And so what you need to talk about is your values or your ethics. What are your ethics? I mean, you have a certain heritage, a certain raising, a certain education. You're from the West. You're a woman. There are things that you carry forward that may have inherent biases in them as well.
Absolutely. We all have implicit biases, every single one of us. And, we're all, like, all of us on this call are pretty privileged. We're in the West. We have a certain education. We have a certain background. But we're also different, right? We have, there's differences and nuances. And before we started this call, some of you were talking about where you went to high school and where you grew up and what you've seen in your life and all of, our ages, all of these kinds of things sort of weigh into how we see the world. And I think, when I think about doing this work, one of the things I talk a lot about is diversity of perspectives, diversity of people, diversity of stakeholders, and kind of bringing people into community to try and get as many perspectives as possible so that we're kind of seeing things from an inclusive sort of space. In terms of my own ethics, I mean, I'm definitely a product of our Western modern world. I benefit from the use of technology, just as we're doing right now, to connect with people and do some of the work that I'm doing, even as I'm also concerned about the technology. So there's kind of like this, kind of dialogue that always goes on internally around how much to share. Just before this call, I just went in and changed some of my LinkedIn settings because they've basically opted everyone in to have their data used for AI training. I don't know if everyone knows this, but this is pretty recent. And so in my community, we're just talking about going in and changing our settings to opt ourselves back out. And I think the part that's a little bit concerning is that they opted us in piece, right? Because ideally you want this idea of giving consent and opting in and knowing what's going on, rather than just having companies go in and do stuff, kind of behind your back a little bit. So that's just a practical sort of use case in terms of how I sort of think about these things. I'm always navigating this. I'm in it as much as anyone else. I don't put myself outside of this conversation. I'm definitely in it every day.
Let's transition into this cost point, the environment. I mean, Yogi, you've raised, and I'm sure you'll raise again, the energy requirements, as you said, a bottle of water for whatever. The energy costs are extraordinary, and the power consumption is massive. And we're just at the beginning. Like, we're only 2 years into this, and we had how many million in the first month, and how many billion it will be, as organizations need to come up with the capital in order to handle these costs. Our energy demands are not going to go away. Renewables aren't going to be able to handle it. I mean, I just came, as I mentioned, from a Fusion Energy Canada board meeting, or AGM. Let's hope to God that fusion arrives by 2050. But do you want to comment at all about whether or not we should be hysterical about the cost to the environment of the rapid growth of AI?
Yeah, I'll respond to that a little bit, Perry.
Go ahead.
So even before 2 years ago, before this all happened, every projection for the amount of electricity we were going to consume in the future as part of the energy transition was huge. And now we've layered on what you've just accurately described as an even bigger consumer. So in the short term, our only choice really, when it comes right down to it, is nuclear fission. Those are things that we kind of, well, okay, I'm talking about the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
Fusion, I'm hoping will bail us out after that. But I see a gap in between supply and demand in the near term, which I'm defining as 5 to 10 years. And we can build all the renewables we want to, but that's not going to take it anywhere where is not going to be enough, as you said. I'm hoping that nuclear, geothermal, and hydroelectric are going to come together. Plus, I'm hoping that on the conservation and efficiency side, there's going to be some gains, but they may turn out to be trivial, given even if they're significant, they may still be trivial in light of the increase in demand. So that's what I see in the forecast for energy.
What's very interesting, Katrina and Yogi, is the infrastructure for the development of AI is in place. That the internet emerged 20, 30 years ago, which created the vehicle or the infrastructure that you need in order to use and apply AI. That's quite unusual. Often as technologies emerge, you get this initial excitement and then it fades because we don't have the infrastructure in place, whether it be hydrogen or even the development of medication where the pharmaceutical distribution systems have to be built. The supply chains don't exist, but it exists for AI.
Well,
But
okay,
Perry,
so
I'm going to jump in on that point because it exists now. And so when I do these talks, I basically say that 2012 was a moment where it all kind of came together. And so, but before that, we went through the hype cycle. We went through AI is going to do all these things. No, it can't. We had a winter. We had 2 winters at least. And so I think that, yeah, maybe the infrastructure is caught up with the aspiration that was put in place back in the 50s and 60s. And so I just want to point that out because it's not necessarily that, oh, it just was nicely there and it kind of like glommed onto it. It was sort of like it took time to get to this moment.
I mean, my personal experience was ChatGPT.
Yeah, ChatGPT, I would say the moment that we're in right now actually started like a decade and a bit ago in 2012, because that was the year that AlexNet happened. And so AlexNet there was a guy named Alex Krizhevsky who won a contest. Alex Krizhevsky was a grad student of Geoffrey Hinton, who you've probably heard about. Many people haven't necessarily heard about Alex Krizhevsky. But Krizhevsky wins this contest with this algorithm called AlexNet. And that was the moment when neural nets really became possible. Because right now, we all think of AI in terms of neural nets and deep learning and building the brain and that kind of thing. It wasn't always that way. And at that moment, that's when we had enough data, which had been going on from the rise of big data since personal computing, the internet, and so forth. It had about 20 years in play. And we repurposed GPUs, gaming computers. And that's because Moore's law had caught up to the point where we could have these fairly fast computers. And that really speaks to, NVIDIA being one of the most sought after stocks on the planet right now. So those things happened about a decade and a bit ago. And now we're benefiting from all of that.
Those things were all the technology, the product era. What I'm talking about is the emergence of a massive demand, which is the emergence of the market. That market really of a public market. People
yeah, but that's a little bit. I'm going to push back on that a bit because I think there's a little bit of like demand creation going on here. Like good marketing, call it good marketing. Like let's put a product out there. We'll make it super easy to use. We'll make it free, even though we're blowing billions of dollars on this thing in the back end and we don't have a profitable business strategy on it. And so we'll kind of bring people in and we'll seed the market with this technology. And I think a lot of that, like that's just, freemium marketing, really. So I'm not sure that the consumer demand, because when I talk to average people, they're not, yes, I was waiting for the moment when the chatbot would come and help me write stuff. That's what I really wanted. I don't hear that a lot from people.
Really?
No,
So
not at all.
back
They
to your
want it to do
comment,
their laundry or something practical.
back to your comment on infrastructure, Perry, you know, when you talk about the data centers and the network, that sort of thing, that seems to be there. All of a sudden, we have the publicly or quasi-publicly accessible digital data, that seems to be there. Another component here that gets less discussion is all the software development that's required around all of this AI. And from the beginning of time until perhaps this year, software development has been a handcrafted cottage industry. Now, maybe AI will itself solve the software development productivity problem.
Well, 135,000 people have been laid off in Silicon Valley because of AI, because of ChatGPT and the learning language. 135,000 last year alone.
Okay, well then maybe AI is solving,
Well, it's
well, to
coding.
me, is a part of the puzzle, and that is the software development productivity. I'll be quiet and let Peter jump in.
Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina. Very interesting introduction to this conversation. I was just going to say that a colleague of mine who was actually did his PhD under John McCarthy, the chap who coined the term artificial intelligence, he's a pure mathematician. He's a very high-end programmer, and he says that the tools that he's been using, AI tools he's been using, do better code than he can produce.
Thank you. That's a great data point.
Which totally makes sense to me, because let's think about what would be the native language of AI? It's probably code, right? Like, it's not English, really. The English is the interface for us. But I think that's, you know, where I do hear people using it daily is people who work in software development. That is very much the use case. And it's not across the board, I would say. Like, there are, you know, there's still the sense that you need to know what you're doing. You need to have the oversight and expertise to see if something is actually wrong. But the simple stuff, and I think coding has been like this remix process for a while now. Like, that's what GitHub's all about, right? You don't necessarily write everything from scratch. You kind of take pieces and stitch it together. And this particular product is pretty good at taking pieces and stitching it together because it trained on a lot of those pieces.
The
Well, I
infrastructure.
think one of the fundamentals that Randall was listing a couple of things in addition to what you'd introduced, Katrina. I posted in the chat a link at the very first posting. It's called Situational Awareness AI.ai. This report I received about 3 months ago. It's very limited circulation until recently, when the Guardian actually, and I don't believe they should have provided a global link to it, but they did. So this now has a global audience, if you wanted to find it in an article that appeared in the Guardian in July, I think it was. But this report, which was custom written by one particular person who used to work at OpenAI, he has, I think, raised some very interesting issues. It's the original article, probably, the one that's certainly among many I've read, that proposed the idea of a Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence. It's all about scaling. So this article, I highly recommend it. You've got to appreciate as well the scaling of the compute resources that are necessary to move these tools forward in terms of greater development and use, because of the amount of people who will probably use them. So I highly recommend. It's a somewhat controversial report. When I received it, it had about 100 people who had read it. And it's definitely something worthy of serious reading if you're interested in this subject. And it's quite readable. It's not, you don't have to be an AI expert, but you certainly have to understand terminology.
Back to the infrastructure just for a second. The infrastructure that hasn't kept up is the legal framework, the guardrails, the recognition that the public's interests may not be, or may need to be protected, that personal privacy is at risk. And we're seeing Europe maybe a little further ahead than North America. North America tends to focus more on technology. Europe tends to focus much more on public and personal rights. But the legal framework seem to be emerging in Europe before it's emerging in North America. Peter, you want to add something there?
Well, I was going to say yes. I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right about the legal, and it is moving along, not just like policy is moving along in the sort of public domain, but individual companies. And I'll give you an example because one from Western Canada is TELUS.
Yeah.
TELUS has a team that's being driven out of the CTO's office, as in the sort of the whole program. And I have a colleague who is at TELUS who's responsible for developing the AI use cases for how they will use AI in the regulation of telecommunications. So it's all about the law and it's all for the legal department.
Well, I'm hoping they get into fraud. I mean, how many phone calls or how many emails you get a day, much less a week or a month, where you know it's fraudulent. TELUS seems to be able to put on your screen that this is potentially a fraud call. So they've got something, some algorithm that is able to detect where these numbers are coming from. But that would be an enormous contribution. Privacy. There's a whole generation emerging that has been living on Facebook, that has multiple personalities on Facebook. It doesn't seem to care about privacy. And yet that, from a public's perspective, becomes one of the primary things that the public seems to want to protect, or the government wants to protect his privacy, when some people don't seem to particularly give a damn about their privacy. Katrina, where are the ethics on this? Do we follow government saying we want to protect everybody's privacy, even for those that don't give a damn? Or what's going on in that space?
Yeah, I don't think that I would totally agree that people don't care about privacy. I think sometimes people underestimate or don't necessarily weigh all of the variables when it comes to privacy. And certainly in the early days of social media, I don't know that anybody did. I think it was just like, hey, this is exciting. Let's all get Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts, not really thinking about what the bigger consequences are. But certainly, and definitely, I'm also biased because I hang out in circles that tend to talk about this a lot more. But I think that people, even when I go to the kitchen table type chats or community halls, privacy is one of the top issues that people are concerned about. So I don't necessarily think it's that people don't care, but I do think they feel overwhelmed by it. I absolutely think they feel like, what am I going to do? Like, this is the big kind of question, right? So I think there's definitely that.
The educational system dealing with teenagers seems to feel that teenagers don't have a particular bias about their privacy, that they seem to not have enough life experience yet to realize the risk of putting personal information online that may reemerge 30 years from now when they're going for a job, and it's out there in the public, whether it be body images or things that they've said or bullying. The schools are now recommending and recognizing, even up into the university, that the regulator becomes the school because the parents aren't doing a particularly good job, and maybe parents need to be better informed and more involved. But the natural forces that we seem to have accepted in the past that were social guardrails were families and the church and the teacher. But they seem archaic nowadays. The parent doesn't seem to have adequate influence in order to contain these impulses of children to talk to one another and throw their privacy away.
Well, as somebody who doesn't have kids, I'm not going to comment on that because I don't really, I think parenting's a tough job and, probably people do the best that they can, but I won't kind of get into that. But I will say that when it comes to kids in particular, we have age limits on all kinds of things, right? There's all kinds of things that we as adults might consume, let's say, and yet we don't allow the children to. And I think we've kind of maybe jumped into this a little bit quickly when it comes to not necessarily understanding what the risks or harms are. We're seeing a little bit, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the best answer, but we're seeing a backlash now, in particular with the ban of smartphones in Alberta schools, for example, kind of swinging the other way in terms of like, okay, let's protect the kids from some of the tech, right?
Well, it takes us into AI specifically, where the universities are seeking policies on whether they should or shouldn't. We've had some interviews with professors that are very positive about the usage of AI and teaching people how to prompt and how to use it for grammatical and spelling and maybe structural reasons, and others are trying to ban it entirely. I had some open discussions with Jonathan Schaefer very early over lunch of concerns that he had, because he had attempted easily enough in a class to ask ChatGPT, I think it was, to tell him about Jonathan Schaeffer. Well, it gave him an incredible biography, but it wasn't him, it was someone in Texas. His prompt was inadequate.
Yeah, that's
Well-
maybe a popular name, right?
So what, I think what happens in that case, Perry, is it's not just somebody else, it's a conglomerate of multiple bits and pieces of people who have that or a very similar name.
Well, we got into that with collective intelligence is when you put a whole bunch of data points out there in the billions and you ask ChatGPT or a learning language model or AI to give you feedback and consolidate, it's going to give you the integration of all of that information, unless the
That's
algorithm
exactly that,
is
yes.
biased in some way and takes you
Yes.
off on a tangent.
I think if I could, just on the question about privacy and teenagers, that we need to take a step back and instead of inventing new rules for them and new things that school has to police and so on, is to take a step back to teaching consciously ethics to our children. They don't have to use big language and big words, but to understand personal integrity and ethics and how you behave even at your young age, especially these days when everything is out there online, is going to be increasingly important. And you have to understand that you and your classmates and your friends need to pay attention to this and have some basic ethical training at home and encourage it to be spoken about in those terms in school as well. And I think far more likely we'll be successful trying to deal with these issues around privacy concerns and the possible impacts of the lack of privacy concerns by some effort to teach and train the younger generation about ethical frameworks and how within the particular culture they operate, they should behave and behave towards others and so on. I think that would help us.
I really like the fact that you brought ethics back to the table because we have technology moving at the speed of light, and I'm not quite sure we're moving at the speed of light or keeping up with regard to ethics. And I think we've thrown some of the institutional structures that we once had to ensure civility in society, which was once called the church, that talked about moral codes. We had the separation of church and state, which has gotten very confused with the evangelical movements, et cetera. And we've got the decline in parenting as the family has broken up with the two parents going out and both having jobs and coming back for an hour or so and not even having dinner table or having breakfast together. So the very social structures that we had for society to ensure ethics before AI, before the internet,
Yes.
have been neutered over the coming years. The editorial that I've written for this coming week is about violence and the need to return to civility, and we're certainly not getting it from our politicians. So where do you get the discussion that Katrina is raising of anybody talking about anything but the excitement of the technology versus what the social and ethical implications are?
Yes.
Where is that leadership and that voice coming from?
Yeah, social and ethical impacts, yes. And that's why I'm saying some educational effort, even if we have to go back to the school, the church in some cases, yes. But at home, at least if we can get some basics, it would help. The other problem that we certainly have seen over the last few years, I would possibly has really led to a lot of this the coarsening of the discourse and the name calling and everything else, particularly in social media, is the anonymity that the web can give you. If people get onto whatever social media platform you like, adopt whatever make-up name you like and yell and scream at people in capital letters and say whatever you want to other people, even if you know they're who they are and know them personally, you can pretend to be somebody else. Just like that old cartoon says.
We did
everybody's a dog.
I'd like to reinforce what Michael is saying, because I think that a lot of people don't necessarily distinguish between ethics and morality. A lot of what the churches and religions have told us over the years is morality, how to be a good person. But understanding ethics gives us personal agency in the moral decisions that we make, gives us a sense of ownership over our own behavior and decisions. But if we don't have that language of ethics, then we're not as enabled to make decisions for ourselves beyond, what we've been told to actually do in morality.
Let's
So
take,
yeah.
Katrina, do you think that coders or these companies that are investing billions of dollars should give us the ethics that they think is right for the public? How does ethics get incorporated into this world of AI development?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that. But just before I do that, I just want to challenge. So we all talked about we all have implicit biases. And as I'm listening to this conversation, I just want to caution this group a little bit, because I'm hearing a little bit of if it only went back to the good old days, the way it was when I grew up and, before the internet and when we had family values. I just want to put that on the table lightly for you to consider your own perspective and your own biases. And the fact that someone who is 15 right now, it's a very different world that they're in. And so we can't just transport stuff and think, oh, well, it was, and honestly, it wasn't the good old days for all of us, right? There's been, as I think I'm the only woman in this room, maybe, I don't know, Adele, I'm not sure, because you don't just ham on, but it hasn't always been great for, for women, for example, in terms of various freedoms. And so I just want to challenge that. But to answer Perry's question a little bit more, I think there's, in terms of what are going to be those ethics, when it comes to organizations, they're going to set their own, ethical determinations and values. If there's regulation in place, that is the floor, right? That's compliance. We have to do these things. But beyond that, we don't necessarily have to. So what do we want to do? And that's kind of set by their own sense of what their values are, and a little bit about what society is going to say, because let's face it, they're going to be impacted by that. They don't want to risk reputational risk or those kinds of other things happening to their business. And so that's really where a lot of that conversation is going to happen. There's power dynamics in an organization. So of course, leadership's probably going to have a bigger say about what is going to happen in the organization. But then there's individual choices that can be made by various actors in the organization who are building the tech or involved in composing the tech in some way. So those can play out as well. And so I think it is going to be done at that organizational level. And that's why I believe regulation is necessary as part of this conversation. It's different than ethics, but it's part of the bigger responsible AI and AI governance picture, because it sets the floor for the minimum standards.
That conflict that you refer to inherent in a organization or within a nation or within a globe is not an easy black or white resolution. That conflict and the resolution of that conflict, calling for some borders, leads to how people go about resolving conflict. And increasingly, it seems that people are certainly not using humor and simply open dialogue to bring about a resolution. We see an increase in violence, whether it be bullying in schools, or maybe we're not having bullying, we're just hearing more about it. But my concerns, and I'm speaking personally, is way too much drift to violence for resolving conflict, and way too much hatred, way too much interpersonal discussions when we're trying to resolve an issue. And all of a sudden we're talking about someone's character, when we've got an issue in front of us we're trying to resolve, and we're trying to basically devalue that individual in the course of coming about a resolution. That's not civil.
Yes, the difference between open dialogue and open mouth.
Well, and democracy presumably is built on open dialogue, and so it accepts a certain amount of chaos. It accepts a certain amount of conflict in the belief that that expression, almost Rogerian therapy, that expression will diffuse all of the pressures, all of the tensions, and allow the resolution of a civil conclusion. I'm just not sure these conclusions are being arrived at. And maybe the complexity, which Randall often say, maybe the complexity of the issues that we're facing as a society today are so great that our institutional structures, which is in a way what Katrina says, the family is no longer adequate. The churches were no longer adequate. The state may not be adequate in order to resolve the complexity of issues which bodies like things like AI are putting in front of us.
Yes, and we are at the same time going through what some call a polycrisis. going across the whole landscape, you know, if you look at the situation economically, if you look at the situation in terms of social responsibilities, if you look at the number of wars that broken out around the world, and some of which we're directly supporting or not supporting, depending. Yes, we're going through a very difficult, challenging time, for sure.
Well, I mean, picking up on a point Katrina makes, and I'm not sure if we agree on this, Katrina. Yeah, I may be over romanticizing parenting, but it's what every individual has. And it has served us well for thousands and millions of years.
Exactly.
I'm not sure that we should be quick to walk away. That's what the neoliberalists believe, that we should abandon our social structures of the past, and the state will take over. I mean, I faced the School of Social Work at the University of Calgary, which was arguing with me publicly that the family was dead, that the state should now assume the responsibility, as should the school, for the raising of the children. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I wanted to suggest that perhaps ethics is, of course, critically important in the world of AI, but it's only one part of a very bigger problem. And the part I would like to introduce is I had probably mentioned this in one of my webinars with your group before, Perry, but it's about integrity, because integrity is universal. Ethics is cultural. A classic example in the context of applying artificial intelligence is to think about the trolley car problem, which of course is an old problem about just basically how do you manage trains or urban transit that travels on trains. You need to have sidings and so on if you only have one particular track. So it's how do you optimize these things? Well, the trolley car problem in the AI context is we're moving towards autonomous vehicles. So we're going to have AI-driven vehicles, so mobile robots, that are going to have to make decisions when there's interference on the roadbed.
Right.
And the classic example in the case of, say, Eastern culture versus Western culture, in the broadest sense, is that as the car is going to come down the road, and it's, as I say, it's autonomous, and this is the scenario, it is going to hit one of two people. It's going to hit either a child or an adult. Then the system has to decide which one it's going to hit. It's going to hit one of them. That's the scenario. So which one does it hit in the East? Which one does it hit in the West?
It hits the child in the East, and it will hit the adult
Correct.
in the West.
Exactly.
But I want to just challenge
So
your thing about
part of the ethics issue.
It is, but I
So how
also
do you
think
program that into an AI application?
Well, it's being done today. I don't know quite how Elon Musk is dictating it will be resolved, but Elon, I'm sure, given his character, is going to tell his programmers how to resolve it. Go ahead, Katrina.
so. A couple things. First of all, I think that integrity is also cultural. So I think your framing of it is definitely coming from a Western perspective, for sure. And we kind of put integrity in the, we kind of put it in the ethics or responsibility camp, but it may not, necessarily be the case where a society values something like harmony. Maybe because integrity is you're getting at this individualism, right?
Yes.
And we're very individualistic from a Western perspective. This is who we are. And so when other societies have a more collectivist standpoint, it's harder for us to kind of get our heads around that. So I just kind of want to point that out and challenge that just a little bit. And then when it comes to the trolley problem, I think we don't necessarily need to program these machines to make these choices, because we don't necessarily need to have those choices being made in a machine. So it comes from a framing of, well, we have to figure this out because we have to have autonomous vehicles, right? We have to do it. So let's figure it out. And I kind of sit back and go, well, actually, do we? Really? And so I kind of come at it from that angle first, and then go, okay, yeah, sure. If you want to, we can tie ourselves in knots trying to figure out the trolley problem, or we can step back and go, well, do we actually even need that? I don't know. Another perspective.
The question of whether we actually need that, the way in which AI is being pushed rapidly ahead on the military front by numerous different nations with very different perspectives and different cultures, is highly dangerous. It's the trolley car problem that are multiplied many times, because nobody in China, for example, is saying, oh, well, we don't want to go too fast, we got to be careful. we just have to be cautious as to whether we do, how we do this so that we don't take any risks with hurting people and so on. And I guarantee you, the folks in the Pentagon and the research labs that work for them and so on are similarly not expressing the need for great caution. They're pushing ahead rapidly to do whatever they can as fast as they can before the other guy does it first, and uses it against us. So
Yeah, and that's the problem, like the arms race, that the narrative. I think a
It's
lot of
already
problem
underway.
is the story we tell ourselves about the technology and the push to move forward. And I think what really scares us is that we might have to live under some other global set of rules, let's say, or some other global kind of perspective when we've had a dominant one for a very long time. And I think that scares us a lot.
I agree, Katrina. I couldn't agree with you more. When the dot-com bubble crashed, and I was convinced that monitoring socio-demographics was of the past. The future was monitoring technology. I wonder, where is the governing mechanism going to come from? Because right now we have this dichotomy. Well, it'll be in democracy at the where we recognize the humanity of the individual, and that the human being and their life comes first, versus the state, and that we have that tension. I'm not sure that that's the future. I don't know where. I watched the Boeing discussion with NASA on whether they should come back or not, take a chance. How much risk were they willing to take? And NASA carried the weight, and they waited, and they're still waiting. And they sent the rocket back, recognizing there was some risk, but NASA had learned its lesson from earlier launches or whatever, where they felt they went too early. Now, in Peter's argument, the algorithm would probably read stop. That's what the algorithm would probably. You force it by saying they need to hit one or the other. Maybe the algorithm doesn't have to go that way. Maybe the algorithm either stops or calls a lawyer and says, what do I do now?
Oh.
The lawyer is tied into AI, and because the lawyer is tied into AI, it can give you an instant response back, and the AI will be responsible for whatever happens next. There you are. I'm playing the game.
Well, and Perry, since you raised it, what fascinated, and I haven't been paying as much attention to that whole situation, but what fascinated me about that story is the lack of interoperability around those docking stations. It was like, we've got 8 of these things, but 4 of those are the Russian, we can't land there. We don't even connect. It's like, we have an iPhone plugin and they have an Android one, and we don't, and it just spoke to me of like the lack of trust, like going back to the Cold War again, which is where AI was kind of birthed out of that time frame, where it was like, we don't trust anyone, and we especially don't trust those people. And and now look at the situation, because what if the docking stations had all worked for everyone? We wouldn't even be talking about this problem, right?
And we've now touched on another layer of issues, and that is the erosion of trust. The rate at which technology moves, and I don't mean just AI, but the rate at which technology moves naturally erodes trust, because the old infrastructures and the old way of doing things fall apart, and all of that social infrastructure and all of the ethics tied into that old technology of the horse or whatever changes, and we're not ready. And human beings get nervous. They seek for some solution. And right now we believe that AI is going to be our new God. I don't say we, I'm just saying me.
I'd like to add something here myself on this. Years ago, I did a cross-cultural impact assessment methodology for Petro-Canada so that they could study the impact of oil development in Indigenous communities. And I became acquainted with social impact assessment. And I just think that there's a role here for doing that on a grand scale. What are the social impacts, the intentional and the unintentional impacts of AI on society, the economic impacts, social impacts, political and cultural impacts, and the synergies and emergent properties from all of those different levels or layers of our civilization.
100 scientists agree with you. 100 scientists signed some document, it's got a name to it, that said slow down. Slow down so that we can, in fact, provide some degree of guardrails or reassurance or social assessments. But my argument again about and Katrina, I think you picked up on this as well, capitalism rules. Competition will bring about innovation. We're going to move forward, and we trust that the end result will be okay, and or that the state will step in time and regulate. That's the world we live in. Peter?
And even
Well,
the state insists on moving ahead
the-
quickly because of this competition with other states. So I think
yeah.
coming back to the ethics issue and integrity, Peter and I and a group of folks, so not just us, in other words, a group of folks who have been working for some time on the concept of an international institute for the study of integrity. And part of that actually would be to take it beyond study and look at how integrity could be used as a mechanism through training and education at the community level, at the corporate level, at the government level, in each case focused on the individuals within that structure to try and build ethical responsibility and ethical ways of thinking and managing wherever your context and whatever your organization, which in turn should, at least in theory, lead to more ethical behavior and ethical consideration of whatever you're dealing with at the moment. Yeah.
Interesting. When I was trained in sales with KPMG, the sales model was integrity selling. That's based on. Katrina, we're in wrap-up mode. I'm going to give everybody a chance to maybe make some comment and further comment, concluding comment. Then Katrina, I'll give you the last word. So, Peter, anything you want to share with us as we're in wrap-up mode?
Well, one thing we haven't talked about, which is maybe a characteristic of certainly ethics and the me world that people have been moving towards, especially the younger people, is the lack of civics, the drop in civics that has happened throughout our society in the last 30 years or more. And I think that's a very important thing, that is, without that kind of civics, you don't have that kind of community. And so there's a variety of things that relate to, you know, buying into social responsibility, in effect, through civics.
That's our next webinar, Peter. If you want to be part of a panel, we won't have a webinar next week because I'm back. I've got to be out of town. But the editorial this weekend is about the need to restore civility. And I am looking for a panel as a response, but right now I'm just going to be asking for replies to the editorial. Yogi, you have a last word you want to share?
Yeah, so when I think about AI, I also, and ethics, I think about the word guardrails as a partial or full solution to that. Perry mentioned it briefly. You know, if I'm a skeptical executive, I've seen some proofs of concepts about AI that I find quite appealing, but I'm certainly worried about the risk. And I know I don't want to have my company name mentioned in the Globe and Mail in the business section with some kind of fiasco. How do I go about some kind of guardrail, and how do I know they're working? Is that something, Katrina, that you cover in your ethics discussions and course?
Well, hold off on your answer until we get to wrap up, and I'll let you handle all of it. Michael, any parting words?
Yes, thank you. Just a thought here that how these things are all interconnected socially and in our current environment. We've spoken about the different challenges right now with youth, for example, and with the increasing coarseness of dialogue in society. And I would just suggest to remind us that it would seem to me at least that quite a fair amount of this disintegration of trust at a social level between individuals and organizations has been one of the outcomes, or at least is accelerated by the COVID-19 impacts that has had on so many people over the longer term. And that combined with what was already happening in some societies, including the US, and in Canada, where significant swaths of the communities don't see that there's a way ahead for them. They don't see that they're benefiting from the changes that are happening around them. They don't see for the first time the prospect of actually being able to have a future life better than their parents did. And they're getting annoyed, frustrated, bitter, angry, and confrontational increasingly.
Well, in the interest of time, we'll carry on after the recording is over, Randall. So I'll let Katrina have the last word, and then you can stop the recording and we'll carry on and have an after party. So Katrina, you've got the last word. Anything you want to share with us?
Sure. I guess maybe I'll answer to Yogi's point about guardrails. Absolutely. And I think depending on which group I'm talking to, I'll come in at a different level for conversation. So if this was a business and we were having more of a executive conversation, we talk a lot more about risks and specifically what are the ethical risks in your business and what are the ones you should be concerned about and what are we going to do about them. And so I have whole programs and courses that really address that. But what I love about the conversation that we've been having is it's very free ranging and it's going in a lot of different directions. And I think the theme that I'm picking up on is that while we have a lot of technological progress, we haven't done as much on the social front, the political front, maybe even the economic front to help people. And those things are all interconnected, of course, alongside with the technical. And so for me, it's about how do we move forward? So it's great to learn from the past and maybe even talk about the past and what were the good things from the past, but how do we actually take the moment that we're in and then advance those other things alongside with the technology? So that's what I really think about when I think about kind of the work that I'm doing and where we need to go as a bigger society.
Well, thank you, Katrina. I think you've touched on an extraordinary point, extraordinarily important point as I'd wrap up, and that is the rate at which we as a challenges are yet to be addressed. And we can push democracy, we can put our foot in the accelerator, we can do all we can. And what we seem to be seeing is I wouldn't call it chaos, increased tension, that somehow we're not getting the answers right. And the system seems to be failing us. And I don't want to talk about the failure of the welfare state or the failure of the UN, but the institutional structures and the professional structures and the universities are all wrestling with the same thing, the socio-technical challenges that are confronting us today.